What is up, YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to go through and break down how to set up your macronutrients, those being your proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And ultimately, if you did not see the last video on this channel, definitely go ahead and check that out. I will put a link in the top right of the screen right now for you guys. But ultimately, I went through in that video of how to set up your maintenance calories and then how to adjust depending if you want to get shredded or you want to put on some lean tissue mass and ultimately bulk up and just optimize your muscle building potential. And with that being said, let's hop straight into now how you can break those calories down into those macronutrient sources that I did mention. And a couple of things that we need to be aware of, and I need to make you aware of if you're not already, is the different macronutrients and then also the calories per gram that they do have. And ultimately, your proteins will have 4 calories per gram, and your carbohydrates will also have 4 calories per gram. And ultimately, the fat is the only oddball out in the macronutrients with a 9 calorie per gram. So in the last video, I did go through and do my body weight and then calculated my maintenance calories off of that. And based on my activity levels, my height, and whatnot, my maintenance calories came out around 3,400, and also my body weight was at 218. So that's what I will continue using in this video. But hopping straight into how you would break these down now. First, looking at the protein. Uh, my golden rule and a golden rule among the fitness industry is ultimately to keep your protein around 1 gram per pound of body weight. There are a few exceptions to that, which I'll get into right now. And ultimately, if you look a bit right of that highlighted box, you can do anywhere from zero point 0.8 grams per pound to 1.2 grams per pound is the range that I would recommend. And the reasoning behind having that zero point 0.8 per pound to 1.2 per pound is ultimately your body composition right now. If you are somebody that is holding a bit more fat mass, say you are upwards of that 20% body fat range, you may want to go with a protein per pound of roughly zero point 0.8 or a bit under 1, just because your lean tissue mass is ultimately a bit lower than your actual body mass. And you don't want to be eating too much protein to the point that you ultimately can't get enough of your other two macronutrient sources. And then ultimately, when you are deeper in a cut and you are at a lower body fat percentage, and say you're in a big calorie deficit, keeping your protein higher at that 1.2 or even 1.25 grams per pound can be beneficial, as your body may be converting some of those proteins into an energy source. So you ultimately want to have as much protein as possible so you're still getting enough protein to orchestrate muscle building properties in that muscle protein synthesis in your body. And then moving on to the second macronutrient source is fats. A lot of people will recommend that you go with a zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.4 grams per pound. And then ultimately, your fats are one of your essential macronutrients, and there's a reason that you have essential fatty acids. I'll throw up on screen right now some of the benefits that do come from having enough fat in your diet. So as you can see on screen, there's a ton of different benefits that do come with it. So ultimately, my recommendations would be to keep your fat intake at 50 grams or greater per day. If you're a smaller human being, say maybe the 100 to 130 pound range, then you might be one of those exceptions that it may be okay to lower your fat. But essentially, you want to keep enough fat in your diet to make sure that you do not have any repercussions from not having enough. And then ultimately, the last macronutrient source is carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates amount will ultimately come from the leftover calories that you do have from your proteins and fats. And I will go through the calculations down below to really explain this so you guys can have a better understanding. But ultimately, you would just use your maintenance calories minus your protein intake and your fat intake added together, both in calories, and then subtract that. And that number you would get, and then ultimately divide by 4 to find how many grams of carbohydrates you could have in a day. So now using my metrics that you do see above, like my body weight and my maintenance calories, so let's go through and just calculate out what my macros could look like. So starting off with the protein, my protein intake, I like to keep it around 220 grams per day, which is just around 1 gram per pound. And just going back to that golden rule, one per gram per pound is a really good number to be at. So ultimately, if I take that 220 grams per day and multiply it by 4, then my calories in protein would be right around 880 per day. And now moving on to my fat intake, roughly I would put it at 87 grams per day, and I believe that's towards the upper limit, right around zero point 0.4 grams per pound. Correct me if I'm wrong with that in the comment section. But ultimately, the reason that I do like to keep my fats a bit higher is I grew up having a fat based diet, and I tend to actually uh, not have a better, I would say I have a better, more consistent energy level with a bit more fat in my diet. So ultimately, with that coupled with having 3,400 calories per day, which is quite a bit for most people, your maintenance won't be that high. I do like to have a bit more fat than that 50 grams or greater that I would recommend. And ultimately, I will keep my fat towards that 60 number, even when I do start to diet down and cut my calories. So now calculating that out, 87 times 9 comes out to 783 calories in fat per day. So now if we go down to my carb intake, we'll hop straight over to the calculation first, just to get that figured out for you guys and ultimately calculate out how I did get this 434 grams per day. So you will take your maintenance calories, which is 3,400 for me, subtract that 880 for the calories in protein, and then add on that 783 calories in fat that I do take in daily also. And then ultimately, when you do calculate out those numbers, you will come out with my calories and carbs coming out to 700 or 1,736, excuse me. And when you do divide that by 4, you will come out to 434 grams per day. And ultimately, my macronutrients, I would say, tend to be a bit over on my fat and then a bit under in my carbs, more like 370, 380 grams of carbs, and more like a 90 to 95 in fat. But ultimately, that's just my personal preference to have a bit higher fat. So really, these two macronutrient sources that I do have highlighted, you can definitely play around with depending on what you do enjoy. If you do enjoy a higher fat intake, say you really enjoy your nut butters, your avocado, your whole eggs, stuff like that, that really brings up your fat content, you can eat a bit more of that. There's a reason that keto works as a diet because fat is very satiating in general and is a bit harder to process in your body and takes a bit longer to break down, so you have better energy levels. But my recommendation ultimately would be not to bring your fat too high, as your carb intake will a, have an effect ultimately on your training ability. And your carbs in your body are easier to break down and are an easier energy source for your body to actually use than fats, unless you are actually in ketosis, which is a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day. But for most human beings, ultimately, your carbs are a better energy source than your fats and are easier to break down. So I would recommend keeping those fats at a reasonable level, but with discretion, you can change these up a bit. And if you do or are somebody that really loves your pastas and your breads and stuff like that, your cereals, stuff like just anything along those lines, and you do want to bring down your fat, you definitely can. And it will be a lot different depending on what your maintenance calories are. And ultimately, you just need to play around and see what works best for your body. Unfortunately, there is no cookie cutter way to diet, and there is no cookie cutter diet that's going to work for everyone. You got to just put in the work and ultimately figure out what works best for you and what you can actually stick to when it comes to a diet. But my golden rules to take when setting up your macronutrient sources is ultimately make sure that you're right around that 1 gram per pound in protein to make sure that you do or are in uh, muscle protein synthesis throughout the day and are just putting yourself in a place to put on lean tissue mass. And then also with that, I would recommend not lowering your fats under that 50 grams, as I did mention and showed on screen some of the benefits that do come with having enough fat in your diet. But ultimately, outside of those two rules, you really can play around with how you set up those macronutrient sources. But, anyways, if you do have any questions, comments, and concerns about how to set up your macronutrients or your calories for that matter, definitely leave them down in the comment section below. I'd be more than happy to discuss things. And if you think that something's wrong in here, you don't agree with something, definitely comment it down below as well. I think having a discussion is part of the learning process, and everyone can learn a bit from each other as we go forward. But ultimately, if you did go on to enjoy the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as it does help me out a ton and means a lot to me. And with that, just have a great day, and I will catch you guys in the next one.